welcome back after the lunch break to the third panel of today's conference that will be centered around the role of technology in diplomacy. Specifically, we want to look at how technology in diplomacy can contribute to solving current most pressing issues. My name is Klara Brunnsteiner. I will moderate today's discussion, and I'm honored to welcome with me on stage our four distinguished speakers, who each bring their very own unique and insightful perspective into today's topic. To my left is Ms. Nina Kickinger, who works as a project manager for the Space for Water project and Associate Information System Officer at the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Then Dr. Alexander Klimberg, who is a senior fellow at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and the Washington, D.C. Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then Mr. Clemens Leitner, who is a cybersecurity consultant and brings more of the perspective of the private sector. And to my very, very left, Dr. Claudia Reinprecht, Deputy Director for Digital and Tech and Diplomacy at the Austrian Foreign Ministry and former Ambassador of Austria to UNESCO. Before diving right into the topic, I would like to address the audience with a quick question that I would love if you could perhaps answer with a show of hands. And the question would be, what do you think, which role technology can play in the future of diplomacy? Do you believe it to pose more of a risk or of an opportunity? So first I would kindly ask everyone who believes that technology in the future of diplomacy is more of a risk that needs to be carefully assessed to raise their hands. Okay, we have a couple of raised hands, couple more. Okay, thank you. And now I would like to ask everyone who believes that technology is more of an opportunity for the future of diplomacy to raise your hands. Okay, also a couple of raised hands. Okay, there seems to be quite multiple views on the topic, some raised hands for both opinions. I really look forward to today's discussion. I hope we have some enlightening insights on the matter, and then look forward to your questions at the end of today's discussion in the Q&A section, where we'll dedicate 15 minutes to discuss a bit also with the audience. Yeah, thank you. And with this, I would like to hand over the word to our distinguished speakers to briefly introduce themselves and their personal assessment of technology in the future of diplomacy. And first, I would perhaps kindly ask you, Claudia, to share your perspective, having worked in the Austrian Foreign Ministry. What are the biggest risks or opportunities you see in regards to technology and the future of diplomacy?
Well, thanks first of all for inviting me. Good afternoon to everyone. I think there are two, one has to distinguish. If we talk about, the role of technology in international relations and how to, govern it, that's one thing. That's mostly what I do. If we look at technology as a means to further diplomatic objectives, that's a whole different story. I think the first one is much more interesting. But I can address both. So, is it more of a risk or an opportunity? Honestly, I'm not sure if it comes down to a binary answer. So I think when it comes to the first one, policy, there's too little tech diplomacy happening in relation to actually fast pace and the prevalence of all kinds of technologies that actually have a really strong impact. And we can talk about this later, and it's obviously anticipatory governance that we're looking at. And for the second question, I think technology in diplomacy is partly underexplored, but sometimes already there. I'm just thinking at how technology is used in cultural protection, in AI is also used a lot in nuclear security. So there's a lot of things where things are happening. I think there's not really clarity in how best to use it. Some is also how do you manage the risks of technology in diplomacy or in the field of, say, international peace operations. That's one thing that I think the UN is concerned with. So it's a vast field. So in order to have a proper answer, I think one should be clear what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you for this introductory insight. And perhaps you, Nina, bring a unique perspective by having previously worked with space-based technologies at the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. In your assessment, how do you see the role of technology in diplomacy?
I would also like to thank you for the invitation before I start and briefly mention that I'm speaking as a private person and not on behalf of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs here. I think AI has a huge potential generally, but there's also risks related to it. And when it comes to diplomacy and international governance, I think the formation of norms and the development of rules and regulations is always lagging behind the innovation and innovative spaces that are being created. And it's really important to regulate some of them because states still need to ensure that human rights are maintained in those virtual spaces as the subjects of international law. Now, we also need to be really careful, I think, with the biases that are created when we train machine learning algorithms with data that are including the biases that we as humanity have, but also dependent on the data sets that we train them with. If you look at the human rights that need to be safeguarded in spaces, and that's to be done by member states, I think what is really key is that we maintain humanitarian values therein. But then, on the other hand, if you look at the potential for various fields in which diplomacy is also relevant, yes, then we have a lot of potential of new technologies. And for instance, COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, regulating space activities of member states, sees the use of AI increasingly relevant, for instance, for space traffic management and maneuvers, avoiding collisions and things like that. If I think of the use of technology in diplomacy, I was thinking of where we're going to go to, considering, for instance, the use of AR goggles, glasses that would maybe help us not only in translating. We might need to be less fluent in languages in the future. Let me put it differently. We may be able to communicate better with people from other nations speaking different languages, yes, but there's also a risk in losing the human element in relating. Diplomats, I think, are trained in human connection, in reading other people, not only based on what they say, but also a lot when it comes to the mimics. And I think a lot of this information is very context sensitive. And I think there's a risk of losing what makes us really human in there.
Okay, I think that's a very insightful assessment from your side. And I would next like to give the opportunity to provide a perspective to you claimants coming from the private sector, an expert on cybersecurity. How have you, in your experience, coming from your experience, how would you see the role of technology in the future of diplomacy?
I think it's already there because, thanks for having me, but I think it's already there. If you look, for example, at the Ukraine war, and Israel not selling Pegasus to Ukraine because they didn't want them to have the tools for strategic reasons. It's quite interesting because for everybody who doesn't know Pegasus, it's a malware or a Trojan horse which is used by governments. And it's being used by countries which are friendly with Israel usually. So, for example, the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, after that, all the states who signed it were offered the software. And I think it's already being used. Tools, information in intelligence are used to do diplomacy in that area, and are also used to build alliances in the Western world, but also in other parts of the world. So I think we are already there in some sense, but there's not a lot of regulation or not a lot of frameworks going on, or some of them are missing, I would say, in that area, which governs that a little bit better.
Okay, thank you for that assessment. And then finally, Alexander, if you would like to maybe add on to everyone's thoughts that have already been shared, from your perspective working in cyber policy, what is your introductory assessment?
Well, thanks first of all for inviting me. It's always good to be back at the DA. First, I'd like to start on a personal note because earlier this week, my mentor and friend, Joseph Nye, passed away. Besides having had the honor of teaching with him at Harvard, I also worked a lot with him over the years, and I was trying to figure out what's the best way to honor his legacy, and the recommendation was put forth that I could maybe weave him into the question that was being made, and I thought that was an excellent recommendation because Joe actually was always concerned with how technology and international peace and security interacted in two primary ways. The first was the risk of technology. Joe's primary accomplishment in his early academic life and also diplomat was what he saw as lowering the risk of inadvertent escalation, accidental war, accidental nuclear war due to misunderstanding of technology. So first as an academic and then as Deputy Secretary of Defense, he always advanced how important it was that we understood the technology that we were trying to negotiate on. He took that interest then into cyber, where then I worked with him in a wide different levels of formats across different governments and multilateral formats to try to understand the cyber technology, which at the moment we really don't. But also, at the same time, the transformation of societies, which leads then to a whole new different governance question. So part of the opportunity is that now diplomacy engages with a whole wider range of stakeholders than it previously concentrated on. In particular, our area of tech diplomacy and international peace and security of cyberspace, which like most areas in diplomacy was universally reserved to governments, now you have a much stronger involvement of the private sector and civil society. As an academic, but also as an advocate for the free internet over the last 20 years, and as someone who's written a lot on both of these topics, I think it's an incredibly powerful opportunity for those who believe in the advantages of a free society, like I do and like Joe did, to be able to use this opportunity to leverage the power of the non-state actors of civil society into diplomacy. So for me, it's definitely both, but I would say the benefits of technology will outweigh the consequences if we can survive the negative consequences.
Okay, thanks everyone for these introductory assessments. I think we can all see from the many examples that were also already raised that this topic is highly relevant. And now I would like to go into what we can do in practice, like on the level of state diplomacy, especially in the current geopolitical climate, where sometimes balancing security concerns with international collaboration in the area of technology, especially where commercial, scientific, and strategic interests intersect, seems like a fairly difficult, challenging feat. Perhaps, Claudia, how would you say could diplomacy adequately address the pace of innovation and technology?
Again, a multifaceted question. Are you interested in how diplomacy can contribute to furthering, for a European diplomat, it will be, the competitiveness, productivity, and innovation ecosystems in Europe? What is our role there in the complex, policy landscape, and against the backdrop of our current geopolitical development? That's one question. The other is, are we talking about multilateralism and how it is affected by technology?
Yeah.
And how technology itself has become probably the most decisive factor in a lot of not only multilateral but also bilateral relationships. And one
I think it would be really interesting to maybe just
EU-US,
start.
for instance, a lot of questions on this, and they all intersect. You alluded a bit also to the issue of digital divides and technology divides, so it's very difficult to unpack it in a way without getting lost in the fog. But I think the idea was a bit to look into how, diplomacy is all about dialogue, right, and international cooperation. Right now, we're in a situation where, and we're not talking about any technology, we're talking about, the top-notch critical technologies, mostly not yet there, emerging and disruptive would be the NATO label for them. And I speak particular for those that are considered to be, relevant for national security. And that's very much quantum, AI, advanced semiconductors, but many more. There's a whole list. I think the NATO list of 10 critical technologies is quite instructive. So these are considered so important that control of them is highly governed in the sense that access to and control of these technologies is highly withdrawn sort of from the multilateral arena. So how do you do that? Export controls, foreign direct investment controls, research security is an interesting new policy field, which goes very much in the sense of how do you, or rather, all these sort of economic security measures tend to rather erode the default position of international cooperation as we knew it. And how do we deal with that? Mm-hmm. Because, again, it runs counter to what we normally do. It's about, technology or innovation is one part where we think that's, a field where we can leverage, improve our bilateral or multilateral relations. I mean, technology and innovation is one of the most single important things for the global south. It's very important to them. And for them, export controls is a way of actually hindering their right to development. So we are really a bit at loggerheads multilaterally on this issue. And I think, again, you need diplomacy to diffuse a bit of these tensions. So that's the critical part. And very difficult because, we're talking about legitimate security questions after all. Mm-hmm. And it's a quite complicated or rather complex story where we still have not really figured out how best to go about it. Again, it's not a binary issue. It's not neither nor. I think we need to be much more granular and sophisticated in our analysis. And yet there, we're still trying to get there as we more and more understand how these technologies are actually affect international relations. But right now, in our current climate, there's very little multilateral discussions taking place. Mm-hmm. You have very much unilateral or actions. You have very much friendshoring, unilateral, I call onshoring of how you solve issues on a global scale. So I think that's a bit the challenge. And then again, what I think is underrated is that we also multilaterally look at how these technologies can be governed in the sense of not regulated. I don't think that's the level of where we should be looking at, but very plainly to have an inclusive global discussion of whether these technologies go in the right direction, or the development and use of these technologies go in the right direction. Do they serve common good? Do they serve to achieve sustainable development goals? Do they serve sort of for the maintenance of international peace and security, for the protection of human rights, and again, sustainable development? I call it the holy trinity of the UN, strategic objectives. And that's the key question that we are right now not really tackling. A lot of things are taken out of multilateral discussions, or diplomacy is used to basically stifle discussion. Autonomous weapon system is one where it's kept in a bubble and dragged on for years and years and years, and no progress been made. And other examples would give it.
I think these are all really great points, and I also think Nina, that you have some insights into because we mentioned the global south and we mentioned opportunities for collaboration and building trust through cooperation in the area of technology there. I think your project, the initiative you're working on, Space for Water, is perhaps. Would you want to share a perspective on the topic coming from working on that?
I will share about that. I have a short reaction to what Ms. Reinbrecht previously said, because when it comes to technologies, like in 2012, there was the World Summit on Information Society, and there was a shift from a multilateral governance that was meant to be within the context of the ITU back then to multi-stakeholder governance. So yes, we opened up to be more inclusive and have a forum to discuss, but in such institutions there is no mechanism, there's no binding decisions that are being taken, but rather recommendations. So I'm curious to hear also from the others, maybe later on in the discussion, what do you think about this development? I see a lot of potential in multi-stakeholder governance per se, for exchange, for mutual learning, and for taking in like science perspectives, informing decisions, but we don't get to decisions in these fora, and this can be problematic. Well, on the other hand, we have a huge reliance on a few private companies for certain technologies that are driving developments, and they don't have a social contract with the citizens of the world. So I think there is things that need to be considered moving ahead in the future. Now, in the context of Space for Water, the project I work on, there is multi-stakeholder collaboration taking place, but again, this is a place for exchange. What we do there is we invite actors from all stakeholder groups to come together in the context of our stakeholder meetings, where the co-design of space-based solutions, mostly focused on remote sensing, to address water issues globally, are being shaped and co-designed. Now, if you look at satellite technologies and remote sensing in particular, they offer an objective view of like something they see on the Earth. If we think of building trust based on these technologies, one example would be, let's say you have a river commission, they are managing a river together, or a non-permanent body that would look at the data together. You can build trust by having them do it together. Why? Because if we train an algorithm with a lot of data, the other state might not trust that the results that experts from one country are really reliable and reflecting the truth, let's say, about a river. You've probably heard about the Nile dam and Egypt being affected by not having enough water now. Okay, it's a very contested topic, but let's say there is two countries who need to manage a water body together, working together, looking at the data together, and having the confidence in this objective data can help building trust if they do it in collaboration, versus if everyone trains their own models with their own data, there's no chance, by the amount of data that are being used today, there's no chance that you can check how the results were being arrived at, especially because if you think of certain, it's getting techie here, but certain algorithms that are not even transparent as in how they get to their results. There's other initiatives like the Water Peace and Security Partnership using technology and participatory analysis to forecast conflict and supporting early action based on the results they get from that. There's also the early warnings for all. They're all relying on satellite data in many cases to develop actions that help humanity address issues.
I think that's some very interesting points, and also I think we talked about the topic of gathering intelligence, Alexander, and you talked about, also mentioned a chapter from your book, The Darkening Web, about how the relation between intelligence agencies and traditional diplomatic channels is shifting. Maybe you can relate that in a way to the area of potential for collaboration?
Well, I will pick up on what was said before, because I just want to make sure that also the students in the room get their numbers right. The World Summit Information Society is 2005. It starts 2004. That was at Geneva Summit.
In 2012, there was the shift to the...
But WSIS is 2005. That's the start. And then it continues. We have in September, Claudia is involved in negotiations, so am I. And we have the 20 years of the renewal resolutions, just what we're talking about. And great that you brought up the multi-stakeholder definition that is implicit in the 2005 Tunis Agreement, which is something also I want to draw attention to, because also was just mentioned that companies don't have, the private sector doesn't have a social compact with their citizens. So re-invoking against Joe, we would say that's not automatically the case, because if you follow that logic, then basically only governments are representatives of the people, and civil society and private sector is the opposite, and the civil society is the battlefield. And for those of you who are familiar with political science, that's a neo-Gramscian view, or also Marxist view of how power works. And if you take a more liberal view, civil society is an independent actor in space, and also the private sector can be an independent actor. So we like to think that it is possible to have a social contract besides government, and that is also the premise of the WSIS agreement. So with that context, let me just pivot back to your original question on on the spook planet. So basically, in my domain, what I work on, cybersecurity, it's esoteric from two different points of view, which poses a unique challenge. It's esoteric in part because, indeed, the intelligence agencies have been in the lead of the exploitation of these capabilities for decades. The first hacks go back to the 1980s, and ever since then, it's been heavily invested in signal intelligence and other capabilities. And they have accumulated a huge amount of knowledge on this subject, which also effectively means that most intelligence that is gathered today is not human intelligence, it's somehow cyber-related, and is modified and controlled and used with computers. Everybody's getting excited about AI. We've been using machine learning algorithms in this space for over 20 years. So the importance of the intelligence community has greatly grown on this, and that, however, leads to a second problem, which is the other esoteric problem, which is the understanding of the domain. It's incredibly complicated. In one of the first books I did for NATO in 2012, the National Cybersecurity Framework Manual, we defined 5 mandates for cyber: the military view, the diplomatic view, the counter-cybercrime view, the critical infrastructure protection view, and the intelligence view. And they were all different, they have all different interests, they all focus on different technological issues. And that makes it very difficult for people who work in one very specific silo to be able to talk to the other silo at every level, so including the technical level, but also at the political level. That means, for instance, also that the interests are different. Law enforcement wants to arrest cyber criminals. Intelligence wants to exploit them, watch them, maybe use their tools. Very, very different interests. So that's the second problem. And the third problem this all results in is that we're talking about the information domain. This is literally the first domain created wholly by humans. And since 2012, the United States has, for instance, accepted it as one of the actual domains of action, air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, except we define the laws of this domain. There's no gravity in cyberspace that we cannot shut off and on at will. So this is about information, and in that meaning is that some of the attacks and some of the activities we witness in cyberspace are not about technical issues or the confidentiality, integrity, availability triad that I learned as a hacker in the late 1990s when I was a kid and advising a number of cybersecurity companies, or the World Economic Forum where I was the head of cybersecurity. It's more down to what you do with that information. How do you form opinions? So since you're able to form opinions in cyberspace, and you also define the way those opinions are formed, it becomes an incredibly powerful tool for those specialists that control the information, the intelligence agencies, but also those specialists that control a silo or even a cross-silo domain. So it's a very, very interesting time for diplomats, in particular because diplomats always have to be a generalist, always have to front their entire community, and I think it's one that maybe is only equivalent to trade and other very complicated issues in its multifacetedness. But definitely it has to do with the fact that we have now created a whole new domain of action that humans have to address.
Thank you. I think there were some really interesting points in there, and then also I think we've now mentioned quite a couple of times the role of private companies in the private sector in the area of technology and diplomacy, and perhaps claimants, from your perspective. Would you like onto that?
Yes, I mean, I'm not that big of an expert in general. If I look left and right to me, I think I have far more experienced specialists here. But working for a cybersecurity company, we notice threats every day from nation-state actors and also non-nation-state actors. And I think this is quite interesting, what you mentioned with the information that's coming into that space. Because if I have, for example, North Korea attacking a private company in Singapore, stealing 1.6 billion US dollars in crypto, we have a problem here. Not just a problem for the private company, but also a problem for the countries involved in this, because North Korea, for example, has made it their business model to steal money from other countries and banks to finance their atomic programs and other things. And I don't think we have quite figured out to deal with that yet. And private companies are trying with intelligence agencies and bigger countries to build software, build safeguards to protect companies and also information like how to build semiconductors from actors like this. But I think we have failed in that sense, because if you look to China, they are now building their own graphical GPUs for training their own AI models. If we look to North Korea, they're really successful with stealing money, like really, really successful. And if we look to Russia, Russia is still building their tanks with integrated circuits from Taiwan. So in that sense, we have failed to control that information. We have failed to control certain parts. And this is also one of the big risks, because you have a lot of actors that want this information. But we haven't quite figured out how to protect it. And I think the private sector, for example, for small countries, is very important to protect those assets. So we did testing for critical infrastructure in Austria and tried to protect those parts. And small states don't have big intelligence agencies which can protect those assets. So you go back to the private sector and say, okay, what software can you give me to protect this? Usually we go to the Americans, they have the software, we buy that for them and then protect our critical infrastructure. So it's a big part of getting that information from intelligence agencies, also threat models, also vulnerabilities that they disclose, hopefully, and protect our own infrastructure in Austria or in Europe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think, Claudia, from your perspective, in the face of these threats, how do you see multilateralism remain functioning effectively in the area of technology and diplomacy, while attempting to deal with these dilemmas posed by buying perhaps software that is necessary for protection from
well, I think
actors who have
again too many apples and pears and all the rest of it together. Maybe unpacking it. I mean, what Clemens was saying is a cybersecurity, cybercrime issue. There's lots to be said. Cybercrime Convention, we'll see. Cybersecurity is a very, of course, there's also cyber diplomatic side to it. But honestly, that's not my domain. I'm sorry, I cannot say anything on this. Maybe something more for Alexander. If you break down the question rather, again, how do we as diplomats understand how these technologies, and I'd rather pick up on where Alexander ended, sort of that, this, for me, the most contested diplomatic field right now is the information space. Of course, cyber is one field to attack, but it goes much broader than, of course, and then you have, all these kind of hybrid threats, disinformation, hate speech, the whole pollution of our information ecosystems and the integrity of our information ecosystems. These are all specialist policy fields with all kinds of people working on these things. But it goes beyond also, and that's for me a bit more tech diplomacy. Again, how do emerging and disruptive technologies affect international relations? And then you can break it down. Some of it, are cybersecurity relevant. Quantum, for instance, when you talk about quantum cryptography. But there's more to it, It can be also used as an antidote, so we can explore all this. But you have also quantum sensing. That could be possibly more interesting in the field of, sustainable development questions. You talked a lot about, apart from the data analysis, that a lot of things that we're trying to do is having better sensory, better measurement, better sensory things. Quantum could be a game changer. When we talk about information as a battlefield, I think it's hugely interesting to look how the convergence of certain technologies, bring us to a whole new unprecedented level of manipulation, surveillance, and well, what is there more? Manipulation and surveillance and
Censorship.
and censorship, indeed, and censorship that we have not seen before. You know, just look at the way AI and neurotechnologies can change people's behavior, together with immersive technologies. You can call them persuasive technologies. It's a whole new set of things that are out there, and we have not fully understood. There are very few people who understand it, because these are really, and this is just not something that, you know, one person can understand. Quantum in itself is not easy to understand. Neurotech is not easy to understand. Immersive technologies is a whole new set of technologies that's not naturally comes natural. So understanding them, how they all take together, is impossible for one, talking about multi-stakeholder approach, silos and all the rest of it. I think that's very clearly where we have to go. The way diplomacy worked, that's past it, you know, we're past the whole only intergovernmental field. Of course you have to be engaged in multi-stakeholder discussions and in multi-stakeholder governance frameworks, because it won't work. Every hands and every brain's on deck to really solve these very mind-boggling questions that we have very little knowledge out there. And I'm a big fan of technology, you know, as a you know, something that can really propel us into all the solutions that we'd like to see. You know, I mean, for us, it's sustainable development. You know, that's the global blueprint of everything that we're looking for. You know, it has everything in there: security, human rights, ecological, social, economic questions. It's a pretty broad blueprint that, for me, you can formulate in different ways. You know, you can say international security, human rights, and sustainable development. You can also say, sorry, I'm getting now blabbering and turned away. But my point is, we can only do it through multi-stakeholder approaches, and we can only do it by also, I think, ditching something that diplomats have been very much, or what to say, but where diplomats have sort of, or diplomacy has this culture, century-long culture. We cannot just wait and see. We have to be much more proactive. We have to be anticipatory, and we have to get out of the silos. Mm-hmm. And I think another key conclusion in this new whole post-digital world is we have to stop to see the world, apart from the fact that we have to stop being binary. We have to stop looking at the world as though we can tick boxes, you know, what some people call a compliance approach. You know, you have a list of things that you have to do. I think that's over with, also as a diplomat. We have to be much more creative, much more thinking out of the box, do more than what we've been doing, which is really difficult because we don't have more resources. But then again, technology can help, you know. Okay,
thank you. I think that's a really interesting perspective. Also, perhaps for you, Nina, how would you see that multi-stakeholder governance models could operate more effectively in the area of technology and going forward into the future?
How could they work more effectively? Well, I think you have a huge potential by the dialogue that they allow for, and by the space for exchange that is being created by them. And then I guess people engaged in these negotiations, they go into other contexts. They will go and affect how national law is being drafted, but also maybe engage in other multilateral contexts where decisions are being taken, and these decisions will be informed by the exchange that takes place in the multi-stakeholder fora. But I think a lot is also being done not only at the moment of like the encounter in those fora, but in between the sessions. I think there's also an approach to engage other actors that have been affected by the digital divide more, like there was the Global Digital Compact, envisioning to secure human-centered digital future. And objective 5 of that is to enhance the governance of AI for the benefit of humanity. I think there's a lot to be done in that field.
While the process of the adoption of the Global Digital Compact was considered by civil society as a backward process, because it was very much in the intergovernmental space, and it drifted away from the multi-stakeholder approach that started with visas and all the rest of it. If you like the Geneva, I like to say the Geneva spirit, if you like, as opposed to the New York spirit, which is very much state-led, very much top-down, were very much politicized. I mean, you don't have any digital tech experts in New York, and these guys were the ones who basically negotiated the Global Digital Compact. So there's a power play going on, and the Global Digital Compact, it's got to be a huge challenge now, making sure that we take this piece of work, which is not bad in itself, but that it doesn't, undermine the existing process that we've been built the last 30 years or so, not only in internet governance, but in digital in AI governance. If you just look at this is something that really bugs me till now. The Global Digital Compact created 2 processes / fora, the AI Scientific Panel and the AI Global Governance Dialogue. If you ever read the white paper submitted to the Chief Executive Board, that something like 40 plus UN organizations worked on to show sort of the current existing architecture on AI global governance in terms of processes, in terms of norms, in terms of organizations and stakeholders that deal with it. It's enormous what is already out there. We're talking about 40, or let's say 30 plus, it doesn't really make a difference, right? UN agencies deal with AI in one way or the other. And then we've got all these multi-stakeholder bodies like the IGF, the BICES Forum, and in between there's lots of things happening. And the Global Digital Compact in New York, these guys, and again also the high-level advisory board on AI, which was pretty much ignorant on what was already out there, and came up with all kinds of proposals, such as the panel, such as the dialogue. Bringing that back into the fold, making sure that we don't duplicate, because, the UN is not the richest organization in the world. So we will have a big problem making sure that we put back the genie, the more reactionary spirit that manifested itself, put it back into the good old bottles of multi-stakeholderism, and putting them back into a very technical, sophisticated architecture, as opposed to creating new processes in New York, where you have, diplomats who are not trained in these fields.
I wanted to add on that,
that they take over, and then this is really the big, although I don't like binary descriptions, but it's very much about state-led and multi-stakeholderism.
Yeah, I think that,
and of course,
in the view of time, because we want to have some time for audience questions in the end, and I feel like maybe we can sum up all of the points that we heard about the different actors
Good point.
engaging. Maybe you want to go for some.
Sure.
Alexander?
I mean, it's a good closing point. Really, think just what we just heard now beforehand from Nina, and then also how Claudia connected that. So just to give you an example, the multi-stakeholder definition has become effectively a point of conflict between 2 effective power blocks. So we are back in a Cold War type situation, where the like-minded group, also known as the West of liberal democracies, is dealing with a cyber-authoritarian bloc, and in between are all the non-aligned, and everyone is fighting for the definition. And the definition is the multi-stakeholder that the West kind of puts forward, which is also important for internet governance, is a more inclusive definition. Basically, everybody in their own areas of expertise decides, while the government focus, which is very often also what international organizations want, is that civil society and private sector may advise the governments on these issues rather than actually be responsible, which of course is a problem since the private sector actually builds everything in cyberspace and the non-state actors actually code everything of relevance in cyberspace, and governments can only blow things up and spy on things. They don't really build anything. So that's just you already heard here a little bit in the weeds. Claudia and I have been dealing with the GDC and the ramifications of that for a while and before it started. It's a typical example of you cannot separate technology from global power and global power politics. It's reinforcing it. In some ways, we've gone back to where we were in the Cold War with similar actors, and digital authoritarianism is a real thing that also, not only actors in some democracies, but in particular, less democratic states really profit from. So my appeal here as a summary note would be to go back to what Joe and I and the neoliberal tradition of international relations teaches you, which is don't see power as a monolithic block that only focuses on governments and tanks. It's also about the private sector and the civil society. It's also about hard power and soft power. It's a lot more complicated than that. And it also means that everyone has a role to play in this. And it also means everyone has a responsibility to do the right thing.
Thank you all. I think we have heard some really interesting points. After hearing all of what the panelists shared, I'd be curious to check back in with you, the audience, with our starting question. Has your perception of viewing technology's role in the future of diplomacy as either a risk or an opportunity shifted? Would you now say technology is more of an opportunity, or do you think the risks outweigh? Or we also made space for probably maybe it doesn't even help to see it in this dichotomy. Maybe it makes a lot more sense to see this issue in much more varied layers. I want to open the floor now to questions. I see there's one back here and one here and one here. I think perhaps 3 questions for the first round will be nice. Yeah, just perhaps introduce yourself with your name as well, so that we can.
Hi, my name's Sean. I'm a second year here at the DA. I'm from Canada and currently writing my thesis about the impact of technology on the US election cycle. And so you were bringing up earlier on, you mentioned the idea of social responsibility and saying even corporations aren't necessarily exempt from that, but not only are corporations, I think, fundamentally exempt from that, it's entirely based on the profit motive, and governments also don't care about the social responsibility. And in fact, we see with technology this heightening opportunity for manufactured consent to be more aggressive than it's ever been, and kind of this polarization into smaller communities, and especially with human psychology, it opens up this massive opportunity for right-wing populists to aggressively tackle reactionary responses and incite radicalism. And so I don't know what the question is so much as I just had to disagree with that point. That I think that it is an inevitability, but there is a huge risk that's involved, but technology will inevitably be involved with the government structure, and I think we will have a hard time as diplomats in the future trying to work with governments who feel like they don't have to work with others anymore, that they can just manipulate the dialogue into whatever they want and just to hell with everybody else.
Thank you.
I'm going to collect.
Let's all collect them.
Yeah, perhaps take the 3 questions and then get into answering them.
Hello, my name is Anna Beska and I'm an alumna of the DA. I have also recently worked with the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, OIF, which campaigns, amongst other things, for multilingualism and language diversity on the international stage, and AI is one of their main concerns. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the linguistic argument of technology and AI in future diplomacy. As we all know, most of the AI content is in English. The data that trains the AI is also in English. Do you see this lack of diversity, of linguistic diversity, as a hindrance, a standardization of the minds, perhaps, in the field of in international diplomacy. You mentioned, Ms. Reinprecht, technological development in the global south. If we're thinking of the African continent, of course, a lot of those countries are French-speaking, francophone. So, what is your take on that? On the linguistic standardization of what trains AI today? Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps one third question. I think, yeah, we can go for your question.
I think the gentleman here really raised his hand very early on.
Yes,
before he gets too frustrated. Give him a chance.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you for the great presentation. I'm Ibrahim from Ghana. I'm a second-year MS2 student. My question goes, it's more about the information sphere, right? So when we come to information governance, how it affects diplomacy. And then this boils down to, say, the information, the technology divide between the global south and the global north. So if the global north has capabilities that the global south lack, how do we build trust and cooperation in our liberal international order? Should there be a blowback? What are strategies or resilience measures we could have in place to solve these issues that might rise? So as diplomacy, diplomacy is there to kind of veer us away from tensions, how do we also make sure that technology doesn't also present another challenge within this, say, ever-evolving times that we find ourselves in? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any one of you for like the first question from Sean here? It was about social responsibility and the diplomats that will perhaps yeah.
But I mean, I could also just touch on the other two. I think it was addressed towards me anyway. But so there was 2 points in that, I think, question, because you mentioned the second part of it was manipulating the narrative, which is another issue that diplomats do have a lot of experience in dealing with, and perhaps less novel than it really seems. Let's go back to your original presupposition. So there's not only stakeholder capitalism, there is also shareholder capitalism, there's also stakeholder capitalism. That is the whole basic purpose of the World Economic Forum, and frankly, it's also the bedrock of the so-called neoliberal tradition of international relations, which has nothing to do, of course, with the liberal school of Chicago for those who are thinking about that. Nothing at all. So that notion that corporations are an actor that have other interests than only the profit motive, which of course is very unpopular, by the way, in the current administration, which is why they want them to get rid of all their DEI policies and everything else, is kind of like baked in. So at the moment, and we have actually seen that in practice, despite what certain tech bros might have been doing recently, and actually the end of the first Trump administration, where it was actually U.S. big business that basically came down and said, no, actually this election really did happen the way it was supposed to, and it was fair, and we're not going to put up with this malarkey. So it was actually corporations, Coca-Cola, for instance, and others that basically stood up and really took a position. That they're not doing it right now is of serious concern. But hey, you know what? Civil society in the United States isn't doing very much either. Actually, no one is doing anything. So if you want to worry, be very worried. We're all terrified, yeah? Joe was terrified. Everyone's terrified. But it's not about the private sector not having a social compact right now. It's all of us actually having to ruck up and take some civic responsibility. So they're failing, we're failing, you're failing, we're all failing right now, okay? So linguistic divergence, I think, was an excellent point. Just a very quick point on that. It's also, our English is being trained, not by America, by the way, and ChatGPT is actually being trained mostly in Kenya, which is why a lot of the English peculiarities in ChatGPT actually have Kenyan English in them, which nobody notices, which is wonderful. That's how you can spot, as an educationer, when somebody's been writing with ChatGPT, because it will use phrases and words that are most common and effectively in African English and not in someplace else. But that aside, absolutely, it's always been a French obsession about how norms are created and how norms create policies and language, and we're now seeing that it's very much true. And so I think one of the next developments for the information sphere, we're seeing this in internet governance overall, is trying to encourage the multilingual web and try to build onto that. But that gets us to the third point, which is about the global divide, and in particular digital divide, and the next billion that we're trying to reach, but then forgetting about the fact that there's a couple of billion that have also not been properly represented. And that is a problem that they are now mostly confronted with, not only content that is completely alien to them linguistically, but also culturally, and they do not have a way to respond. And speaking as someone who is very much aligned with the free internet multi-stakeholder model, I still also believe that governments do have a very valid and important role to play to make sure that those voices are represented in the Silicon Valley and the other places that effectively have taken over this debate. And indeed, which Europe has done a great job so far in trying to steer the regulation discussion. So the tech divide is a very big issue that can be spelt in many different ways. It's not only a question of global south and global north, it happens in our societies as well, but also the way culture helps define the way we interact in the information sphere. So both of those things play a role. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And perhaps if we also move on to the third question really quickly about information governance and how that affects diplomacy, perhaps any of the panelists would have a point to add onto that?
I'd like to just pick up on the point with the digital divide and the technology divide, because that's really something I grapple a lot with. And for me, it's not the solution, and maybe it's even an inadequate solution. But, you know, I'm a really fervent believer, and maybe it's because, you know, I spent 5 years working within UNESCO, where it's all about, you know, the role of culture and identity and very much this feeling that, you know, a global dialogue is needed, and you first, because, you know, that's the spirit, that's within the Charter of UNESCO. Wars begin in the minds of men. It's in the minds of men where the defenses for peace are constructed, and I'm a strong believer in the Charter. It's a beautiful Charter, actually. And I'm a strong believer in the mandate, and I think UNESCO is probably the most appropriate organization for the challenges of the 21st century. One of many, but a very, very much undervalued one. And one thing that most people don't know is that UNESCO is also the only UN organization that deals with ethics of science and technology. And why is this relevant? This is not just for me a nice to have thing, ethical, because it sounds a bit like, yeah, nice, but what is it? But for me, you know, if you look at the ethics of AI discussion, which was quite important a couple of years ago, that went on in UNESCO, and I remember very well because, you know, people from the global north came up, from a European state, came up and said, why do we have this discussion on ethics of AI within UNESCO? It's not the right forum, and on top of it, the OECD and others have already done great work. Why do we need that? And I remember very clearly the Egyptian colleague who came up and said, you know, you guys, we've not been on the table when you discussed it. This is now our chance to put in our perspective. And that's when I realized one thing. It is so true. We never have global inclusive dialogues about these things. There was another experience that I had, you know, which in a way, in its accurateness, you know, was in a way an eye-opener. Not necessarily because I understood it already, but the way he put it was so really made a mark on me. And that was when I was actually in Geneva at another conference, and I met the telecom regulator of Jamaica, and he was basically saying, you know, we are quite fed up with the fact that, you know, you have some boys, white boys, somewhere in the West, creating all the kinds of new technologies, everything done like this. They reap the benefits, but socialize the externalities. And we, from the Global South, have no means to deal with that. And again, it's about, I think, and I come back to the ethics thing, and the need and ethics is a good start to have a global inclusive discussion. That's a multilateral or multi-stakeholder business you can do in UNESCO, for instance, that you start talking not about principles, but where we as a global community want these technologies to go. Do we encourage all stakeholders, in particular also, you know, reminding the private sector, but not only the private sector, also research communities, technical communities, everyone in their roles and responsibilities, to make sure that the development and the use of these technologies are geared towards the achievement of sustainable development goals
I think,
for everyone.
yeah,
And
that's
if
a
we
good
make that
note.
happen, you know, I'm not sure whether it really changed the world, but we changed the discourse. We have something to do, because the discourse right now is dominated by very few.
Okay.
It's basically a couple
Yeah.
of men in this world who tell us where the future of our humanity will go. And they create already very, very strong, effective images of our future. And we are all starting to believe it. I think we have to stop that. We have to create and work together to create the images of the future we want. Not that Elon Musk wants, or Sam Altman, or whoever over there.
I think that's a really great, strong message to like,
And-
because
and-
we're also
and
already
this is
like
your task as
it's
diplomats
almost
who
at
come
the end
in.
of our time.
To be, it's not always about peace, the big high diplomacy things, but having discussions like this with, with the private sector, with the academia, with technical communities, and technical communities in the digital field, with all kinds of stakeholders in your societies. The broader and more inclusive these discussions take place, I think the better results we get. That's basically the promise of democracy.
Thank you. I think that's a really strong note to end on, and also send you all off into the coffee break for a bit. I think it is safe to say that technology changes both the way diplomacy is conducted, as well as the goals and outputs that it has. And while holding risks worth considering, it also holds incredible potential in having a positive impact in our world. And with these big words, I'd like to send you off into the coffee break. We'll resume with our last panel for today on the future of international organizations at 3:30 p.m. Thank you to the panelists for this really insightful discussion, and for all of you for listening and participating.
Thank you.